Welcome to another one of my occasional booktube videos. I just finished reading this book, which is called Denison Avenue. So Denison Avenue is a small residential street in Toronto. And this book is very much a tale, not just of Toronto in general, but really of the upper downtown neighborhoods of Chinatown, Kensington Market, and Harvard Village, the parts of Toronto which also happen to be most dear to me. This novel follows the story of a 70-something-year-old Chinese-Canadian woman named Wong Cho-sum. And I think it's set in 2013 because there's a reference to the Rob Ford scandal in here. So the book starts out in a kind of postmodern style, i.e., that there are a lot of pages that just have a few words on them and they'll be put in diagonal format, or sometimes they're written as poems rather than in prose. And at first, I was kind of indifferent to that. I felt like, okay, well, it makes the book go by faster. I guess I can say I read a book faster, but it's also kind of more satisfying when you get the full prose. But I came to appreciate that choice by the end of the book, because for much of the book, that style disappears. But when it comes to the end, it goes back again. And I realized the reason for this, or my theory, is that both the beginning of the book and the end of the book are about intense loss. So it's almost like the protagonist is lost for words, and what she feels incredibly intensely. So her perspective comes out in these sharp, pained statements rather than in nice flowing prose. Another way I could describe the mood at the beginning of the book, when it's in its sort of first very postmodern moment, and the end of the book, is it's kind of like the relationship between Toy Story 3 and Toy Story 4. So, spoiler alert, just in case you haven't seen those movies, Toy Story 3 ends in a bittersweet way, with Andy deciding he should give his toys to a young neighbor. And when I went to the movies to see Toy Story 4, I was expecting, okay, they made a new one. This one is going to be lighter. They're going to make this more like Toy Story 1 and 2. But instead, they managed to have an ending that was even more bittersweet than the ending of Toy Story 3. And I felt like the message, therefore, of the Toy Story saga became, life will always come with more loss because we are mortal. And that's kind of the dynamic we get in this book. You have loss at the beginning, and the character learns to cope and find some kind of balance for much of the book with little bits of sadness. And then suddenly she has another moment of intense loss again. Life is suffering, but luckily we have all this joy in between. So, anyway, the bulk of this book is told in a kind of day in the life style. It's like one of those indie movies that doesn't necessarily have much of a plot, and you just enjoy watching the characters being themselves. And it's a book that's best positioned to be enjoyed by those who are very familiar with Toronto. The author, Christina Wong, is constantly name dropping streets, and not just big streets like Dundas Street, for instance, or College Street, but streets that are specific to these neighborhoods, like Denison Avenue, like Ulster, etc., etc. That said, my experience reading this book, there's an interesting duality, because on the one hand, it feels intensely familiar because it's set in Toronto and, in a time when I was already a young adult person, but it's also very specific to this Chinese community. So while the main character Cho Sum and her husband, who prefers to go by Henry, his Chinese name is Si Hei, they have lived in Canada for years. Cho Sum manages to kind of live within this Chinese immigrant bubble. So she can speak kind of conversational English, but anytime it gets into slang or into more complex subject matters, she's not fully fluent. As such, the book is largely written in her native language, which is Toisanese. I think that's how it's pronounced. And as I understand it, this is basically its own language. It's maybe sort of a dialect of Cantonese, but apparently not really that mutually intelligible with Cantonese, and certainly a different language from Mandarin. And this is funny because I kind of took it for granted. You see a Chinatown and you assume the dominant language in it is going to be the dominant Chinese language. I just took it for granted all these stores and people would be speaking Mandarin, when in fact this character has this scene where she goes to the Lillian Smith Library, a library located just north of Chinatown. So they have all these Chinese language books. And she becomes anxious because she realizes all these books are printed in Mandarin rather than Toisanese, which more of them would have been printed in the past. So again, the style of this book Lots of the dialogue is written in Toisanese. They'll put the English translation in brackets immediately afterwards. And the Toisanese, it's not written in Chinese characters, it's written out in Latin letters. And my instinct when reading this was to assume, okay, this is to force all readers to actually engage with the sound of Chosun speaking, to not just glaze over her text if it was actually written in Chinese characters, but to actually read the syllables. But there's actually even more nuance to it. So apparently another dynamic with these Chinese languages is when they're just written in characters, their distinction can somewhat disappear. What makes these languages different, even not mutually intelligible, is often the vastly different pronunciation of these characters. So, ironically, Christina Wong seemed to decide that writing them out in English letters was a better way of representing the Toisanese language than using Chinese characters. But I think of all the experiences I had learning about language with this book, the most interesting thing is sometimes I want to look up particular phrases that get repeated in the book. But because they're spelled out in English characters in a way they generally wouldn't be, often I found I would Google these words and Google would have no idea what I was talking about. Sometimes there'd be no results, sometimes there'd be a few results that were clearly unrelated. So, for example, there's this phrase Chosun keeps using, which I inferred from the context must mean Chinese born Canadian or, like young assimilated Chinese person or something. But when I put that phrase into Google, nothing came up. The more interesting phrase that she keeps using is Chan Lao. And Chan Lao, it explicitly tells us, is the name these characters use when speaking Toisanese to refer to Honest Ed's, which was this beloved, kitschy bargain store that existed in Toronto until 2016. And it was iconic for all kinds of communities in Toronto. I think for some communities because it offered, bargain prices and it was a survival necessity for them. But even for others, it was just a very interesting, decorated place. So I was curious, how did they come up with this phrase, Chan Lao? I mean, is Lao the equivalent name of Ed somehow? But I look it up and there's no reference to it anywhere. So the fascinating experience of reading this book is it kind of forces you to leave these secrets in the real place with the community. It takes one back to a time where knowledge actually was specific to communities, where you couldn't just mindlessly look up information. And to be honest, sometimes I hate all the power that the internet gives me. I miss having that element of mystery, of research actually being a bit more challenging. So that all said, now that I've talked about all these experiences that I didn't know, one thing I did find very relatable in this book is the scene where Chosum attends a community meeting on the future of her neighborhood. It's an open forum where residents try and communicate about what they find important about their neighborhood, because new development is expected to happen. And inevitably, what ends up happening is people shout out various contradictory platitudes about progress and preservation, and some facilitator, puts them all on a whiteboard or a flow chart or something. There's also this grumpy white woman who makes some racist comments. And Cho Sum, meanwhile, though the other people at the meeting encourage her to participate, and she wants to participate because her husband used to be very enthusiastic about these things, she's kind of lost for words. Now, part of this is her language barrier, but I think part of it is just it can be so hard to capture what you love about your neighborhood, your community, what exactly you need to protect, and only a few platitudes. In fact, I actually attended a similar consultation once, right after this developer had bought the site of Honest Ed's, or Chan Lao, as it's called in this book. And the meeting felt so disenfranchising because in order to let everyone speak, basically you got to say your piece and then you were done. There was no back and forth. There was no chance to seek clarification. There was no chance to allow nuance. I feel like if you want to communicate what you love about your city, what you want to preserve, you can't just state it in terms of simple ideas like heritage, walkability, etc. No, you have to actually lay out the art. You have to give another person an experience. You have to give them a chance to connect with your subjectivity. What actually really frustrated me about the redevelopment and demolition of Honest Ed's is not necessarily the redevelopment of the store itself, because at the end of the day, the people who run it were, profit-driven capitalists. They didn't want to run their store anymore. If they were going out of business, I guess it was going out of business. But what bothered me about the development company who's building apartments there is they weren't just happy to change the Honest Ed site. Honest Ed's leased out all these beautiful pastel colored houses to various eccentric businesses. There was this really cool video store that specialized in horror merchandise called Suspect Video, for instance. There was a rock store, there was a movie memorabilia store, there was a record store, there's a pottery store. It was this colorful neighborhood that looked like it was something out of another period. And now I'm kind of worried when the developer reopens it, it's just going to be generic, higher end, higher price things that doesn't give the neighborhood that distinction. And it's hard to communicate in a community meeting in terms of simple buzzwords. The neighborhood of Mirvish Village has a feel like no other. It's a resource for all Torontonians, a cool place we can visit. You have to actually take the time to communicate what's beautiful about that neighborhood. And I constantly find myself having this experience. What I love about my city is idiosyncratic. I remember the first time I wrote to a developer, it was about this building, and it just had this unique shape. It was kind of a cube. It was a sandstone color, but no one, you couldn't describe it as like a special heritage building, but it just gave the neighborhood some character. And I wrote to the developer saying, hey, when you build the new taller building, maybe incorporate this color or the shape. And of course, they ignored me and just built a tall, generic black tower. And look, I get it. This is a city of millions of people. Developers and governments can't respond to every idiosyncratic whim. I know my love for that building was very subjective, very idiosyncratic. But I think the broader point is when we have conversations, we can't just talk in terms of policies and buzzwords. We actually have to share art. And I think that's what a book like Denison Avenue does. It gets out the beautiful subjectivity of Chosam's experience. I could not say in a couple words what is important to her, what is to preserve, but I could say, hey, maybe more people should read this book and understand what's at risk of being lost. And it's a complicated conversation to have. There's a funny moment in this book where Chosam found out that her husband was buying pens off this man he was sort of friends with, this salesman who came to his door once a year, and he'd sell blue Bic pens for $1 each. And she thought this was kind of ridiculous because you could get a whole package of pens from Honest Ed's for much less than that. Her mindset is, why wouldn't you go for the bargain? But clearly, to her husband, this relationship he had with the pen salesman was special, even if it was slightly irrational. So while we're discussing this book, it's worth mentioning it's formatted interestingly. So half the book is the novel, and then half, or I guess somewhat less than half of the book is illustrations. And actually, you have covers facing opposite directions, one which just mentions the author, Christina Wong, one which mentions the illustrator, Daniel Innes. Now, Daniel Innes is someone who has done quite a range of artistic work, some more abstract than others. And with this book, he was inspired, he explicitly says, by architectural drawings. So they're very realistic looking, but black and white line drawings of various important neighborhoods. And while he's obviously a very talented illustrator, I think this is maybe the biggest mistake with the book. Because again, what Christina Wong is trying to convey here is a kind of subjectivity, these very specific, sometimes arbitrary things that are important to the people who have lived in this community for a long time. And it's not just going to be obvious from a photorealist drawing, especially one that's devoid of color, because one of the tangible points she makes is there are these various colorful buildings built in traditional Chinese architecture that for whatever reason the people who bought them, they repainted this yellow building gray. It's something I can't stand, and you see it in all kinds of contexts. There was this really cool polka dotted pink convenience store around Yonge and Wellesley in Toronto that at some point was randomly painted black. Like, who did that? Why? Or even the Canadian coffee chain Second Cup changed their warm golden brown logo to plain black with plain white font. why? So yeah, I think the one missed opportunity with the book is while I guess Daniel Innes took this opportunity to do these very realistic photo illustrations, I wish he tried to maybe be a bit more cartoonish, a bit more colorful to, try and sell this his sense of change and loss in these neighborhoods a bit more rather than just giving a whole range of viewers these illustrations that because they're so photorealist everyone is just going to interpret kind of blandly and not really hear the story. But I mean, beyond that, as a Torontonian, as someone who specifically loves downtown Toronto, I largely enjoyed this book. I especially enjoy towards the end when a real estate agent tries to convince Cho Sum on practical grounds, oh, she should move to the suburbs. She's like, nah, the real colorful community is not in the place where you're constantly driving and all you see is strip malls. I like downtown. So very much recommend this book, Denison Avenue. If you've read it, let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And who knows, maybe I'll come back with another booktube review one of these days.